So that is one of Scott Ritter's more wrong tweets, which there's many of them. I mean, whoever does the Lord's work of screenshotting Scott Ritter's wrong tweets, because he loves to delete them after he posts them and they inevitably be wrong. Actually, it's funny, you go to his Twitter feed and you really can't find anything more than 3 months old because it's just been wrong after wrong after wrong. So I want to address something that comes up with NATO expansion. First of all, NATO isn't forcing countries to join them. These countries have to apply. They want to join NATO. And in fact, most of the countries that joined NATO after the founding members joined wanted to join because they were afraid of Soviet aggression or inevitably released from Soviet control, whether they were a direct Soviet country or they were just under the Soviet umbrella with proxy or puppet governments and whatnot. The minute they could do so, they wanted to join NATO. And what we're now seeing is an expansion of partnership, not necessarily joining the alliance physically, but partnership with countries that are not in the North Atlantic. So geographically, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization deals with countries kind of in the North Atlantic region. I know we kind of push it with countries like Turkey and stuff, but really we are talking about potentially growing and expanding the alliance, at least informally, in a way that is past Finland, past Sweden, past even Ukraine or Georgia or Moldova, those countries that really want to join and are trying to take the formal steps to join. But now we're looking at countries like Japan and Australia and South Korea, New Zealand, because these countries, although not technically in the region, align geopolitically, align strategically, align in their economics and their government with, excuse me, the collective West, with what it is to be in a NATO country. And because of that, Japan has taken steps to open a NATO liaison office in Tokyo, which is somewhat solidifying its position in the West. And they're doing this to counter China, but also Russia, because Japan has an interest in what Russia does, especially since there's these contested islands that Japan and Russia fight over, called the Kuril Islands, and not necessarily physically fight over, but argue over. And Japan's ambassador to the U.S. recently announced plans to open a NATO liaison office in Tokyo. Japan, which primarily relied on the U.S. for its national security since World War II, has been making moves to bolster defense outside of the U.S., which is a good thing, diversifying its defensive commitments with South Korea, Australia, other European nations, so that it forms a stronger bond between the collective West. Former Japanese senior vice minister of defense and member of Japan's House of Representatives Kenji Wakamaya said, and this is a quote, "The U.S.-Japan alliance has been at the core of Japan's approach to national security. In response to the changing international climate, I believe that it is of great significance to build a multifaceted security network by deepening cooperation with NATO, especially in Europe, while still maintaining the U.S.-Japan alliance at the core of our national security policy. As with deepening NATO ties, deepening ties with Australia, New Zealand, and South Korea, we will strengthen the security network in the Indian Ocean, South China Sea, East China Sea, and Pacific Ocean. It is of high importance for Japan to strengthen these ties. I think that countries that attempt to change the status quo by force should not be confronted by a single country alone, but should be deterred by building a multi-layered security network to provide a wider safety net." Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida also plans to meet with his counterparts in South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand at the NATO summit because they were all invited. They were invited as partners to this NATO summit in Lithuania despite not being a part of NATO, all of which are happy to attend after being invited. An additional agenda item was added after confirmation that the 4 non-NATO countries would be attending, and it now includes how to deal with China's growing presence in the East and South China Seas. In 2022, NATO specifically cited China as a systemic challenge in its strategic concept, and then invited Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and Australia to attend the NATO summit taking place now, calling them Indo-Pacific partners. Now, despite what is increasingly becoming one of the most powerful navies in the world, Japan has actually refrained from engaging China and North Korea when both have blatantly violated Japanese airspace by firing missiles over the country or territorial waters, as China seems to love to do. Japan grew their defense budget by 7.8% last year, and they plan to double their military budget by 2028, which would make it the third largest military budget behind China and the US, unless India and Russia increase their budgets as well. Now, Japan has maintained a self-defense force since 1954 because Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution says that the country cannot maintain a military. The issue comes up, or the really kind of the workaround, is what constitutes a military versus what constitutes a defense force, and that's not entirely clear. But the Supreme Court of Japan has several times said that every country has an intrinsic, wow, words are hard. Every country has an intrinsic right to self-defense. Therefore, Japan has a right to self-defense forces. So now I return to Scott Ritter's idiotic tweet about ceasing NATO expansion. Given the additions of Finland and soon to be Sweden, the promise of NATO to support Ukraine, the wish of Moldova and Georgia to join Ukraine, and now NATO liaison offices in Tokyo and a partnership invitations going to South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, it's safe to say Russia has catastrophically failed at limiting NATO's expansion. Because let's be real, if push comes to shove, NATO wouldn't be North Atlantic only. We are talking about a global treaty organization. It's an organization of Western aligned nations that includes Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea. Probably additions include Taiwan, etc. And because of that, the sphere of influence outside of NATO from a military perspective when it comes to like China and Russia is shrinking precipitously, while NATO's is growing because people want to join and partner with NATO. And that's the bottom line.